Hey there, this is Mr. Bordelon, and today we're going to be talking about supply. So, here's the thing. When we talk about demand, pretty much everything we do with demand is going to be the exact same thing with supply, just in reverse. We're going to be looking at it from the producer's perspective in this end. So, when we talk about supply, same concepts as we did with demand. This is when a producer is willing and able to sell a particular product. Okay, sell, provide, make, however you want to put it. That's the basic idea. But they have to be willing and able to do so. Okay, if they're not willing and able, they're not in the market. If they are willing and able, they are in the market to provide that good. So they're interested in it. But once we know they're interested, then the question becomes, how much are they willing to buy, willing to sell at a particular price? And that is answered by the law of supply. Now, the law of supply states that as price increases, quantity supply will increase. And as price decreases, quantity supply will decrease. Okay? Pretty straightforward on that end. Now, this can also be done as a schedule, just like we did with demand. So, price, quantity supplied on this end. So, adding this up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, has to increase 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And notice it has to follow the law of supply, so as price increases, my quantity supplied increases. And so we can also draw this and plot it out as a graph. Quantity supplied, price, and there we go. There's my supply curve. Okay. And this also has to agree with the law of supply. So here's P1 to Q1, P2 to Q2. Okay? So as price decreases from P2 to P1, quantity will decrease from Q2 to Q1. And that's pretty much it for that end. Okay? Ceteris paribus, like we said in demand, still applies to this. So you're still looking at a snapshot locked in time of the market. We want to see how the change in price affects the change in quantity. And again, the rule for this is about price causing a quantity change. If it's a change in price, then it has to be a change in quantity supplied, and that's a movement of the curve. So this is the basics of what we've got here for terms of supply. Now, if anything else changes, then the entire curve has to shift. And that's what we're going to show now. So here's quantity supplied, here's price. And here's S1, here's S2, that's going to be an increase in supply. And here's S3, and that's a decrease in supply. Okay? So if I have an increase, it's going to be a shift to the right. If I have a decrease, it's going to be a shift to the left. Now notice something from the last video if you watched it. This is the reason why I don't want you to use the words up and down. Visually, if you look at this graph, it looks like the supply curves are moving up and downwards. But if you describe up and down in those terms, you may end up confusing what you really mean. So stick to the words increase, shift to the right, decrease, shift to the left. Do not use up and down. Okay? So, and that includes in your homework, by the way. I don't want to see that either. So that being said, okay, what's ultimately going to cause this to change? Well, let's go back to our general rule of what we had before. If it's a change in price, then it's a change in quantity supplied. And that's going to be a movement along the curve. So coming back here, I could go from point A to point B. That's a change in price affecting a change in quantity. But if I have a change in anything else, depending on what textbook you're using, I believe the acronym is either rotten or tonight. But what if it's a change in anything else, then it's got to be a change in supply. And that's going to be a shift of the entire curve. So what shifts the supply curve? Well, I'm going to use the acronym I'm familiar with, and that is tonight. Okay. T stands for technology. Generally, if I find anything that, some new process, some new technology that makes improves my production, okay, then my supply will change and it will shift to the right. It will increase S1 to S2. And with technology, it's a pretty good bet that that's always going to be an increase. Nobody adopts a technology that's going to make my business worse. It's just crazy idea. So they're not going to do that. Okay. So that being said, O stands for other goods. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute. I'm going to give you that and we'll come back to it. N stands for the number of producers. All right, so what does that mean? Well, essentially, we're just talking about the market size of producers in a particular market. If more, if the price ultimately of the product makes the product more profitable, then you're going to see that producers will enter the market. So we will go from S1 to S2. But if ultimately producers are taking losses, they're going to leave the market. Okay, so that will go from S1 to S3. But notice one of the things I'm saying. I didn't say make the product or anything. I'm saying provide the product. Okay, largely that's going to be a matter of how the producers make stuff all year long on this end. So they will be holding stuff in warehouses. But generally, the dividing line here is going to be profitability. Okay, so that being said, I stands for input costs. And I'm going to come back to that one as well. T stands for taxes, subsidies, and regulations. And I'll come back to that. And finally, E stands for expectations of a future price. Now, go back to when we were talking about demand and expectations of a future price. Consumers typically are going to want a lower price, okay? Producers, however, they want the higher price. And again, notice that what we're talking about here is that we're basing our behavior on some kind of price change in the future. We're not talking about now. If it's now, then you go back to the change in price affecting the change in quantity supplied. But if it's about some price in the future, we're going to change our entire supply curve. So let's say, for example, that I know at Christmas time I'm going to be able to sell more Tickle Me Elmos and make more of a profit. So, but right now it's September, so I can't sell as much. So right now my supply would decrease from S1 to S3. But let's say I was going to increase my supply, okay, that it is Christmas time. Then I go from S1 to S2. That's all this is, all right? Other goods is the substitutes and complements problem all over again. Again, you need two graphs to solve this. But the key difference here is the term in production. What we're saying here is that a substitute is a good that replaces another good in the course of production. Complements are goods that are made together in the course of production. All right, that's what substitutes and complements in production are. So say, for example, that I had steak and milk. And let's make these substitutes in production. Now, let's say that the price of steak increases from P1 to P2. Okay? That means I'm more willing to sell steak at Q1 to Q2. If that's the case, what happens to my supply of milk in this market? Hopefully some of you are starting to get laugh a little bit, because ultimately, if I'm making more steak, then I'm not making as much milk. Why? Because, well, cows that are chopped up into steak ultimately don't make as much milk. And that is really what's going on here. Okay? But now let's turn it around. Okay, let's say that, again, we're going to draw two graphs. And I encourage you to draw these graphs out on your paper. You're going to need to learn this for the AP exam. This is a skill that's quite useful, not just in terms of scoring, but also in terms of reading what in the world you're doing. All right? So again, let's use steak as one of our goods. But this time, let's use leather purses as the other. Okay. So that being said, let's say that the price of steak increases, which means I'm going from P1 to P2, which ultimately means I'm going to produce more steak from Q1 to Q2. Okay? Fine. Thing about this is that leather is a byproduct of, making steak. Okay? So if that's the case, I can use that leather to make purses. So if I'm making more steak, then what ends up happening is my supply of leather purses would increase. So that's what we mean by other goods in that particular example on this end. So the last two, input costs, taxes, subsidies, and regulations. All right. Input costs is essentially what it takes to make a product and the cost of that. Now, this requires a little bit of understanding of language. Price and cost are not the same thing. Okay? If we're talking about price is essentially what we're ultimately going to buy for in the market. We go to the store, go to Publix, we buy some steak. Okay? That's the price that I'm buying it for, and that's also the price that Publix is selling it for. Okay? But cost ultimately refers to, what it takes to make the product. And that's an entirely separate thing. And that's really important especially for micro. So, but keep these two terms separate on this end. For input costs, think about, what it takes to make a particular product. All right. So let's say that milk is a primary ingredient in making ice cream. All right. So the price of milk increases on this end. If the price of milk increases, well, then what's going to happen to my production costs? Well, since this is an input cost into overall production, my production cost has to increase by the very nature of the fact that the price of milk increased. Okay? Now, assuming prices stay the same, what's going to end up happening to my profits? Well, if my production costs increase, my profits are going to decrease. If my profits are going to decrease, I'm going to be less likely to make the product. And that means supply decreases. Okay? Now, why did I show you this? Because this is the narrative, especially the macro students, this is the narrative you need to be able to prepare on an exam. All right? You cannot just simply write that the price increases and therefore supply decreases. You write that, it's wrong. It will not even, they'll just skip, they're just going to point and laugh at you. Okay? Seriously, don't do that. All right? You need to be able to build the narrative from here to here. Okay? Now, let's do the opposite example. Let's say that Coca-Cola, now that's a bad example. Let's say that sugar is a primary ingredient in making Coca-Cola. Forgive my handwriting here. For some reason, it's not coming out really great. But now let's say that the price of sugar decreases. Well, if that's the case, what happens to the production cost of Coca-Cola? It should decrease, right? Assuming prices stay the same, the profits would ultimately end up increasing. That means Coca-Cola would be more likely to make the product, and that means supply would increase. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But notice, you have to get from here to here using all of that. Okay? Macro students, this is easily the most important thing you will be tested on in terms of shifts in the exam. I promise you, you will get this a lot. Okay? So get input costs down. The last one is taxes, subsidies, and regulations. Okay. Now, a tax is just simply a mandatory payment, to the government from a consumer or producer. And notice I said consumer and producer there. Okay. That means that ultimately that can affect demand as well. Just seems like, a good way to commit to it when we talk about supply on this end. But you're going to analyze this in terms of supply the same way you do input costs. If I put a tax on production, that's going to make my production more expensive. If it makes my production more expensive, then ultimately my profits are going to decrease. If my profits decrease, I'm less likely to make the product, so supply decreases. Similarly, let's say that I lower taxes. In that particular case, I lower taxes, my production costs decrease, and ultimately I'm going to be more likely to make the product, which means my supply will increase on this end. Okay. Subsidies, are also going to be analyzed the same way as input costs. A subsidy is a payment from the government to a consumer or producer on this end. That's all it is. Okay. And notice again, I said consumer producer, which means a subsidy can also affect consumers on this end. So for consumers, if I give a subsidy to consumer, they're going to be more willing to buy the product because it just made it cheaper for them. I basically gave them a coupon. All right. But if I take away that subsidy, they're less likely to buy it. For producers, you're going to analyze this the same way as input costs. If I give a company a subsidy, okay, then that makes their production cost cheaper. If it makes their production cost cheaper, well, then they're more likely to make the product. Okay. So in that case, supply would increase. If we're talking about removing a subsidy, that makes it more expensive to make the product. So supply would end up decreasing on that end because ultimately production costs go more expensive, profits would ultimately decrease. So if we're talking about, which one applies to which, this would be if I, put a tax on. This would be if I take a tax off. Okay. This, on this side, this would be a subsidy if I take it away versus this side, this would be a subsidy if I add one. All right. Now, that's a very simplistic idea, but that's the way it goes. Now, micro students, pay attention to this distinction. This will come up also later on, when we start getting to production costs. Now, regulations are just simply rules on how you run your business that are made by the government. In other words, they're a type of law that ultimately businesses have to provide. The general rule is that the more regulations that you have to provide to comply with, the more expensive it becomes. So that would ultimately decrease your supply. Similarly, if I remove regulations, then generally that makes it cheaper to produce, and ultimately my supply should increase on this end. So that's pretty much the long and short of it. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in here, for taxes, subsidies, and regulations. And some of it is political on this end, so that's a lot of choices on this end. But for AP purposes, we keep it simple for what they do. All right. That's pretty much it for supply. If you have any questions, just go ahead and shoot me an email. You guys take care. Bye-bye.